So, perfect. So my name is Darryl Johnson. I'm a PhD in analytical chemist, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a day in the life of being a cannabis chemist. A little bit about myself. I've actually been in the cannabis industry now going on year 6, which kind of is there somebody in the background we can mute? All right, perfect. Thank you. So as I mentioned, I've been in the cannabis industry for about 6 years, which just how new the industry is, that I'm starting to kind of become one of the elder statesmen, so to speak. So a little bit about kind of my background in the industry. So I'm currently the laboratory director at Enthalpy Analytical out here in Berkeley, California. I've been out here since the beginning of the year. And our laboratory focuses on aerosol testing. So we look at things that are actually vaporized. I'm also the president of CH Laboratory Consulting, and that's a company I own with my wife, and we provide technical expertise to cannabis and hemp companies. Prior to that, and kind of really where I earned my stripes in this industry, was at ACE Analytical Laboratory, where I served as a scientific director. And so at ACE, I actually was there from the beginning. We had a building, we had instruments, but I had to build the science and build out the team and everything else. So I was there about 5 years. And at the same time, I was also a contributing author for Vegas Cannabis Magazine. So I wrote a monthly article for about a year, really focused on patient education on topics like why you probably shouldn't mix cannabis and alcohol, and also informing the consumer of things like how to read your certificate of analysis. I also served as a contributing member on the laboratory working group for question 2, which was our legalization question. And basically, once you pass legalization, they really don't know how to regulate. So they look to the industry and community for recommendations and suggestions. So I actually got to make legislative recommendations for how cannabis should be regulated in the state of Nevada. And specifically, I sponsored the things that I sponsored is the mandated for all cannabis testing labs in Nevada to be accredited to the ISO 17025 standard, edible homogeneity testing, as well as edible dosage. So if you're in Nevada, you can only buy 10 milligrams per dose, 100 milligrams per serving of edibles, because we were able to get that through. So hopefully along the way, I've included a lot of interesting pictures. So this is actually a picture of a plant from one of my clients when I was in Las Vegas. And so that's Khalifa Kush. So that's actually Wiz Khalifa's signature strain in Las Vegas. So it was very cool to get to see it up close and personal and actually get to see the plants growing in the grow room. And my background photo on the slides was actually the whole grow room for this strain. So kind of switching gears now, really kind of the focus on the talk is really kind of how I got here, what I do. So let's take a couple of steps back. Talk a little bit about the steps that kind of had to be taken to get to the point where I am. So, as far as undergrad, I went to Piedmont College, which is in Northeast Georgia, and I graduated in 2005. I was a chemistry major with a built-in quantitative analysis minor. So after I graduated, it was kind of graduation, then what? I had planned to go to pharmacy school, but working full-time at a pharmacy, I realized it just wasn't for me. I wasn't great with the general population. So I was fortunate enough to work at a pharmacy benefits manager, but ultimately at the end of the day, I realized that, I really needed a graduate degree to get to the opportunities that I wanted to, and likewise the pay where I wanted to be. Now, interestingly enough, during my time in undergrad, I played baseball, and it was about the same time that the steroid scandal hit Major League Baseball in the early 2000s. And so around the same time I was in analytical instrumentation course, this paper came out going into the synthesis and discovery of THG. And so this was a steroid a lot of people were taking, quote unquote, to clear. So between, my interest just in steroid testing, which got me interested in mass spectrometry, and working in the pharmaceutical industry, I saw Pfizer had a bunch of mass specs. I realized, if I really want to make sure that I have a job, I need to learn how to do mass spectrometry. So I went to grad school specifically to learn mass spectrometry. And so I was at the University of Georgia from 2008 to 2013. I got a PhD in bioanalytical chemistry. My advisor was Dr. Ron Orlando, and our lab just really focused on mass spectrometry-based proteomics and glycomics, so studying proteins and sugars. Ultimately, I had kind of 3 major projects that led towards my dissertation. So it was kind of in phases. So ultimately, I developed high-throughput LC-MS methods for shotgun proteomic analysis of canine prostate tissue. So kind of during the course of my graduate work, I first I had to build the high throughput LC side of things, and then realized if we're going really fast, we got to make sure our detector can handle that. And on the back end, then we applied that to the analysis of canine prostate tissue. Interestingly enough, canines and humans are the only two large mammals that spontaneously generate prostate cancer. So there's a lot of interest in, potential animal models and things like that. Now, this instrument that I have shown here, this is not my exact instrument that I had as a graduate student, but I did a lot of work on a thermo LTQ. So I really learned how to do mass spectrometry on an ion trap. Now, one of the things I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit too was just the process of graduate school. So for PhD students, I had to be a teaching assistant. I had to take 6 courses throughout the time, and then I had to do 3 seminars, one of which was a literature, one of which was a research, and one of which was my dissertation. Also had to do a qualifier exam, and then just part of the process, you're going to present in group meetings, you're going to present in conferences, and you're going to present, you're going to present posters and try to publish. So ultimately, at the end, when I finished in 2013, the marijuana industry really hadn't taken off quite yet. So I had an opportunity to do a postdoc at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. So I jumped at that opportunity. I was actually funded through ORISE, which is the Oak Ridge Research Institute for Scientific Education. And so this was really a great postdoc because I ended up at the CDC and was funded through the Department of Energy. So I ended up working in the Division of Laboratory Sciences on the Chemical Terrorism Method Development Laboratory on the Special Topics team. And so ultimately at the CDC, I really went there to learn triple quad mass spectrometry. I wanted to learn how to quantitate things. During my time there, I really learned a lot about method development, how you validate those methods. Then I got to participate in a CLIA audit, which is basically the auditing of clinical laboratories. Ultimately, really my project and a lot of things that are a lot of work went into developing LC-MS methods to measure human exposure to organophosphorus nerve agents. So we were actually doing screening methods to determine exposure to things like sarin gas. So you may have seen during that time, there was a lot of bad things going on in Syria, and that's really the type of work that we were focused on. Over here, I've also got a picture of the instrument that I use. So it was an Agilent 1290 a 6490 LC triple quad over here. And then one of the other cool projects that my group was involved in that I got to participate in actually got picked up by IFL Science, which was pretty cool. And so we were asked to look into a project of children being poisoned in India. So we ended up determining what they were being poisoned from. It was a specific toxin in lychee fruit. And so we actually got nominated for an award at CDC. So it was a very cool project to get involved with. And then certainly when you see your work on IFL Science, it's a pretty rewarding experience. So I loved my time at the CDC, but I really had a passion for marijuana. And so, towards the end of my postdoc, you really started to see things open up. And so I saw opportunities. So kind of how I got into the cannabis industry. Well, first thing I had to do was I had to do a lot of background research because at the end of the day, we were still, keep in mind, this is still 2013, 2014, 2015. You could still be arrested for this. And so that was my first concern. I don't want to be arrested for trying to do science. Second question I kind of had to answer is what skill set would I need to have to actually be employable? Then there was where are those opportunities and how do I get in front of those people? And so if you take a look here at the map of legalization, really there weren't a whole lot of states to choose from. It was pretty much Washington, Colorado, Oregon, Alaska, potentially California, Nevada, and a few states on the East Coast, but realistically, it's just not the industry that it was today. So I determined that my best plan of action was to write a cover letter, and I knocked on every door I could find. I probably emailed at the time around 60 labs. That was everybody that claimed to be a lab here in the US. And I got told no a lot, and I got rejected a lot. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I found one person, and that's all it takes. So my family and I moved out to Las Vegas, Nevada in early 2016, and I took over as the scientific director of ACE Analytical Laboratory, which was the cannabis safety and potency testing laboratory. As I mentioned, it was really a startup when I got there. So there were 6 of us in that first year. And by the time pre-COVID of early 2020, we had grown up to about 25 people in the lab. So we had really grown tremendously. A lot of my responsibilities as far as day-to-day was ultimately everything fell on me. My name was on the certificate of analysis that we produced. So my job was to oversee all laboratory operations. That included state compliance, ISO accreditation. I did a lot of hiring, staff training, and staff management, handled a lot of client relations. I did a lot of data review. I reviewed just about every COA that was produced while I was there. And ultimately, it was whatever else needed to be done is what we needed to do. Now, this is actually a picture of me with EnviroCan. So keep in mind, cannabis is illegal federally, so there's not USDA certified organics and things like that. So opportunities for other companies to provide those types of services. So this is actually me at a cultivation. There's a bunch of mother plants in the background, and I'm actually sampling for pesticides. So what we would do is look at plants all the way through their life cycle, from being, from the mother plant to the clone, all the way through the flower stage, to verify that no synthetic pesticides were used during the process. So as far as kind of testing, I wanted to go through just a few things because I think a lot of people don't know about the analytical chemistry that goes behind the scenes at a testing lab. A lot of people hear I test marijuana for a living and they laugh and say, well, I'd love to test edibles. Well, if you know how to use an HPLC, I'm interested. If not, it's probably not the job that you think it is. So as far as Nevada was a great state to be because it was very stringent on the testing requirements, which is great for an analytical chemist, lots of opportunities. And so one of the biggest tests or one of the biggest interests that we always get is cannabinoid testing. People want to know how much THC or how much CBD. Well, we do that on HPLCs. And so this is actually an HPLC from one of my consulting clients. They do their own in-house potency testing while they formulate edibles and tinctures and topicals and things like that. So our HPLC here, if you look up top, you've got your mobile phases here in those bottles. Kind of that middle section here is our pumps. That's really, if something's going to go wrong, it's going to go wrong there. Down here, you've got our auto sampler below that and our sample loop. So we're able to do a lot of injections during the course of a day. Below that is our column and our detector. Now, HPLC is preferred over GC because we want to look at acidic cannabinoids. So GCs are too hot for us to look at native compounds. So that's why everybody likes to do that by HPLC. As I mentioned, Delta-9 is probably the thing that everybody knows. CBD is the thing that's most medicinally studied. So at the end of the day, if you're like me, you're interested in HPLC, there's an opportunity for you. Likewise, kind of switching gears a little bit, a lot of the other testing that we did, really looking at a lot of volatile compounds. So terpenes are the compounds in cannabis that give it the various flavors and scents. And so there's a big market into really understanding what's there and quantifying that. And likewise, solvents are used in the extraction process. So we've got to make sure that solvents aren't present. So you do these two types of analysis in the GC phase, but you can put a mass spec or an FID detector on the back end. As you guys can see from my GC chromatogram here, cannabis is really complex. There's a lot of peaks in here and there's a lot of overlapping compounds. So you've kind of got this trade-off here in the industry that I like an FID because it's got great dynamic range, meaning I can see things on the low end and the high end quite easily, but it's just the flame ionization detector. So each one of those peaks, we can't confirm what it is. Likewise, mass spec allows you to actually, confirm the ID based upon mass, but we're limited by dynamic range. Mass specs aren't necessarily the greatest quantitative tool in the world. So it's a lot of back and forth in the industry on what's the better way, making sure that you identify it or making sure that you quantitate it correctly. All right. One of the other big areas in safety testing in cannabis, like it is in environmental and a lot of other industries, is ICP-MS or ICP-AES. So inductively coupled plasma with an MS or an AES detector on the back end. Now, cannabis and hemp are great accumulator plants, meaning whatever is in your soil, they're going to do a really good job of removing. But unfortunately, those metals end up in the flower and the stalk, and ultimately in the flower of the bud, what's consumed. So you've got two types of instruments there. As far as the MS side is concerned, you get a little bit better selectivity and sensitivity. But unfortunately, there's a lot of background heavy metals in there. So it's a constant fight to make sure that you're not seeing things from your environment. Likewise, on the AES side of things, it's a very robust technique. It's just not very selective or sensitive. So, both types of analyzers can be used in the industry. However, you're really seeing the industry trend go towards mass spectrometry. And in fact, we've got two ICP-MSs in our labs. I actually took this photo last night of our heavy metal analyzer. So we can do a lot of stuff on there. I think we're looking at 22 or 23 heavy metals at this time. One of the other big areas of testing and a huge concern is pesticides. Pesticides are great in keeping, allowing crops to grow, but on the back end, we don't want those in our products. And so this is really where the cost of testing went up, was once they started requiring triple quad mass spectrometers. That's really when the cost of testing went up. So just given the nature of pesticides, we've got to use both LC and GC-MS to analyze everything we need. Pesticides are difficult to measure because of stability and reactivity issues. Likewise, cannabis is a very complex matrix, so you've got a lot of matrix in your background. I will say to people, this is the best industry to get your hands-on experience with instruments like this. If you go to pharmaceutical companies, how highly regulated they are, you're probably not touching their mass spectrometers without at least a master's degree, but oftentimes it's a doctorate, versus, in an industry like ours, we just don't have that experience yet. So, I got to provide the opportunity for a lot of people to get hands-on experience with this type of instrumentation they wouldn't have gotten anywhere else. And a lot of the reason why pesticides are so important, this is myclobutanil, which is a very common pesticide used in cannabis. And if you notice here, when we heat it, which is how you consume cannabis, you produce this little compound on the side, hydrogen cyanide, which we know is not very good for us. So, myclobutanil is definitely an important one we want to measure, because nobody wants to smoke hydrogen cyanide. And there are definitely some other safety issues, but I just love to highlight this one just because everybody knows what hydrogen cyanide is. And in the picture above, this was actually one of the mass specs that I had a long time ago at ACE. This was one of our original ones before it broke down. And so you've got an LC triple quad mass spec here. So on the left, we've got our LC stack, and on the right, we've got our mass spec. And so we named this one Leo after the 70s show, the Tommy Chong character. But again, this is probably, as young scientists, this is going to be, cannabis industry is going to be your best chance to get hands-on experience with these types of tools. All right. And then, one of the biggest areas, and this was really an area that I had to jump outside of my comfort zone and learn, was that there's a huge microbial aspect to cannabis testing. So we did a lot of plating and a lot of PCR. Most fails of cannabis products are actually due to microbial contamination. We would use everything from precast plates to agar pore plates to selective growth media, and then certainly the highly selective PCR. And in our lab, this is really where it depends on the state, but we did a lot of total plate counts for yeast and mold, Enterobacter coliform, Salmonella, E. coli, and we could also do Aspergillus testing. And so these are actually plates that came from my previous laboratory, and you can see they're pretty disgusting. You wouldn't want to consume products that were able to produce this. So at the top, you've got a lot of yeast and mold, Enterobacter coliform fails, where these plates are just grossly contaminated. And likewise on the bottom, that is Aspergillus niger, and that's Aspergillus fumigatus growing on there, neither of which we want to consume in there. But you can see those are very large colonies, and that was off merely just putting cannabis into the right growth media, letting it incubate, and then plating it out there. So that's the type of stuff that's actually in products, unfortunately, and why we need to test. So kind of switching gears. So that was, a lot of the testing that we did in Las Vegas, and I loved what we did. It was a great opportunity, but ultimately at the end of the day, I was kind of curious, what's going to be the next frontier in this industry? So if you really look, what we did was a lot of great testing, but we were testing the starting material. We weren't actually testing what consumers were actually consuming. So late in 2020, I got approached by a company that has expertise in tobacco testing. So electronic cigarettes, cigars, into that world. And so certainly in my background, I saw an interesting opportunity here to learn the tobacco side of things. And then certainly where it goes from there is, up to us. And so took a job out here with Enthalpy Analytical in January of this year. And so we're actually a startup lab. So we were previously an environmental lab, and unfortunately COVID just hit really hard. And so we had to the company had to kind of pull back and figure out what we're going to do next. And so we decided to start up a lab out here. We're going to focus on nicotine products, and then certainly see the opportunity to venture into cannabis. So a little bit about I ultimately oversee the laboratory. I'm involved in interviews, hiring staff. I do a lot with P&Ls, profits and losses, and paying bills. So I handle a lot of the financial aspect of it. Then I also oversee the technical development. So right now we're validating a lot of assays and writing SOPs. So I spend a lot of my time reading and writing, so to speak, looking at our data, making sure that our assays are doing what we expect them to do. And ultimately, we are chasing ISO 17025 accreditation. So we want to make sure that we build those quality systems so the data we produce is accurate and reproducible. And I pulled this picture over here. This is actually a smoke machine at the CDC. So as I mentioned, I was a postdoc there. So I was aware of, the smoke analysis that was going on, but I never got to do it. And so this was incredibly fascinating to me. So I pulled this picture off of a website. And so basically with these linear smoke machines, for instance, the one the CDC has here, you can smoke 20 cigarettes at a time. And so it does nothing but smoke cigarettes all day. So I found that to be really fascinating. I said, hey, I think I need to learn that skill set. So we came out here. So a little bit about emissions testing. As I mentioned, this really fascinated me because we are testing what the consumer is actually consuming. I think that's huge because, as we know, once we light things, we're changing phases on a lot of these compounds. Is that good or bad? We don't know. This is very common in the tobacco industry. They do a lot of product safety testing, and they do what they call pre-market testing applications, pre-market tobacco applications, where they do a bunch of analysis on smoke machines and look at various compounds. Now, this was actually a smoke machine smoking pre-roll marijuana cigarettes. So our competitor up in Canada, due to legalities, they get to touch a little bit more product than some companies here in the US. So I pulled this picture off of their website, but basically they're going to do the same thing. They're going to be smoking cannabis cigarettes. Now, you want to use smoke machines really for that controlled reproducible inhalation, but really the science is on the back end that you're not seeing. How do we collect the sample? How do we prep that sample? And how do we analyze that sample? And so that's what we're looking at right now and trying to figure out. As I mentioned, this is really an exploratory mission. I almost kind of feel like we're going to Mars and kind of seeing what's going to happen. So some analytes we're aware of, these are going to be produced and they're going to be harmful, but there's a lot of stuff that we just really don't know. So we're going to be doing a lot of discovery work probably over the next year or two to try to figure out what is actually produced, when you combust the cannabis or when you use a cannabis vaporizer for cannabis oils. So, kind of switching gears again a little bit, I wanted to kind of move in to talk a little bit more about kind of what the cannabis industry looks like in 2021. And so for you guys that are going to be finishing school or thinking about what you want to do next, I'll say there are many more opportunities now than there were 6 years ago when I started looking. Currently to date, medical cannabis is legal in 36 states and adult use is legal in 17 states plus DC. And the interesting thing to mention here is just because it's legal doesn't mean there's a full commerce going on where you can actually legally purchase products. So realistically, for scientists like us, we need a legal system going on to really actually have those opportunities. So certain places like DC, cannabis is legal, but there's no legal avenue to purchase it or test it or any of those other components. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind as you're looking, is just because it's legal doesn't necessarily mean these types of opportunities are there yet. As I mentioned, testing requirements vary by state. So you look at places like Nevada and California, those are great for analytical chemists because they require pesticides, heavy metals, microbial testing. You look at a place like Washington, and that's truly the Wild West. And so, realistically, they're mostly looking at potency. They've done some microbial and some pesticide, but what's required is just potency. And out of that, you're not going to get to run nearly as many instruments or have that technical expertise in there. So it's definitely a very state-by-state approach. There's no national testing standards, which makes this very challenging because the lab down the road may tell, it's 20% THC and my number says 15 and we're pointing at each other going, he's wrong. So at the end of the day, it's tough, but that's any industry that's starting out. Now, I talked a lot about, laboratory testing and kind of what it looks like, from the safety and potency testing perspective. But I also wanted to mention that there's a lot of other opportunities for scientists who don't necessarily want to work in that environment, but want to be part of the industry. And so, as I mentioned, chemists are needed within the industry, not just in the labs. So if you guys look and have ever seen edible products or any vaporizers or anything else, a lot of chemistry goes into producing those. And so if you look, there are lots of extraction facilities. A place like California, I think there's over 300 or 400 license holders just for doing extractions. That's good opportunity for chemists because you're going to need people, there's high-end jobs. You've got lead extractors. I see that really being dominated by organic chemists and people with a good understanding of organic synthesis down the road. But there's also a lot of good, get your foot in the door type of opportunities for a lot of the younger scientists. These extraction facilities are going to need technicians. And, as we know in science, experience is key. So you've got to work your way up. Likewise, for edible kitchens and production facilities, there are edible chefs out there. There are people who specialize in making topicals, tinctures, lots of other products. Think about how things can be consumed. I think probably the wildest product I saw was somebody did CBD infused toothpicks. And so on the back end, we had to figure out how we extract CBD out of those and how we ultimately test them. Now, at the end of the day, the one thing that I will say that this industry needs, especially in that sector, is people who can do math. That is definitely an oversight, and it's really important when trying to dose things like edibles or topicals. Likewise, there's a lot of opportunity for auxiliary businesses. Somebody's got to sell us the instruments that we use. Somebody has to support those instruments. You look at my side project being consulting, of the opportunity to provide technical expertise and help companies solve problems. And likewise, I like to mention the safety and potency testing laboratory here because one of the other things I wanted to mention was there is that opportunity for career growth. So if you look at a safety and potency testing lab, you're going to kind of see three major positions there. You're going to have laboratory technicians, then you're going to have your chemist and analyst, and you're going to have your laboratory management. So it gives, people want their careers to grow. And, it's important as you're evaluating that to go, is this going to be an opportunity to actually, elevate my career in the future? Likewise, on the molecular biology side, I think there's a lot of opportunities for people with that experience: biology, botany, genetics, molecular biology, and all of those sorts of avenues. And so, microbiology was huge for us. We did a lot of plating and a lot of culturing. And as I mentioned, that's really where a lot of fails happen. On the molecular biology side, PCR was brand new when I got out there. So there was definitely a learning curve for me, but there, is definitely going to be a shift moving to more genetic-based analysis. And, PCR is a lot faster than culturing and waiting on things to grow. The biggest area, I think, for growth might be genetics. You're looking at overall genetic sequencing. People want to understand more about their plants, and likewise, potential genetic sequencing of plant contaminants and things like that. And then ultimately, this is going to be like big ag in the sense that you're going to selectively breed. You find plants that you like, specific characteristics, you're going to figure out how to breed those. When you look at corn or any other crop, it has definitely already been through this process. You're going to see this in the cannabis industry. And likewise, at the end of the day, it's botany and crop science. This is a plant. At the end of the day, it's not cannabis cultivated. We're farmers. We're growing plants. So, we need to not lose sight of that. And kind of the pictures I wanted to highlight here. This plant over here on the left doesn't look very good. It's not very healthy. And so, one of the projects that I worked on with a cultivator was to try to figure out why his plants looked so bad and they weren't producing nearly the yields that he was used to. Ultimately, we did a lot of troubleshooting and figured out he stressed out his plant really bad because the water he was using was too hot and the plant didn't like it. So, as much as cannabis is a weed, there's still finicky aspects to it. And likewise, the picture on the right here is actually a 40x microscope. And so we had a sample that failed salmonella. We were just really scratching our heads about it. Ultimately, when we looked under the microscope, you can see those brown spots are actually dead aphids. So there's actually little insects in there. Nobody wants to consume that. So if you really look at our job and what's important, my job is to make sure you as consumers don't consume that product. So we took that very serious in there, and it was quite important to us. But as you can see, this is on a microscopic level, which just highlights the need for analytical microbiology and molecular biology type testing. All right, kind of switching gears here. I wanted to end, talking a little bit about, kind of taking a couple steps back, going, okay, what types of advice or what are the things that I wish I would have known 10 years ago, before I ventured down this road. So kind of advice for those of you that might be interested in grad school. My path was taking a little break in between undergrad and graduate school. And I will say that that work experience was incredibly valuable. You really learn things like time management, an understanding of a bigger picture out of that. So don't be afraid to, take a little bit of time off. It's hard to go back, but sometimes that time off can be very valuable. Ultimately, I recommend you like who you work for. If you don't like your boss, you're going to need them, you're going to need their help, and you're going to need their guidance. So ultimately, I think that's got to be factored in. Likewise, I did not know this at the time until I started looking, but if you're in graduate school for things like chemistry, microbiology, there's a stipend. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, I did not pay for grad school. That was paid for, and I think I made about $22,000 a year with my stipend. And so, unfortunately, that was your only income. But likewise, if you do it right, you can probably finish without any student loans, which was huge for me. So cost of living should also be something that you think about. I lived in Athens, Georgia. $22,000 goes a lot longer in Athens, Georgia than it does in, let's say Berkeley, California, where I'm at now. So, don't be afraid to think about those things. Likewise, probably the advice or a couple of questions I would recommend asking. What's your average time to graduation out of the group? You don't want to be there forever. What are the kinds of jobs that students are taking after graduation? Are they actually getting jobs? Does your group have any funding? Are you going to be TAing your whole time? And are you building those skills that are going to make you employable down the road? As I mentioned, I wanted to learn mass spec. This gave me that opportunity. And this was actually me on graduation day with my PhD advisor. So that's Dr. Ron Orlando there. Still, I love Ron. I love chatting with him, and we still stay in touch to this day. So again, I highly recommend you like who you work for. All right, and then just kind of wrapping things up here, I wanted to talk a little bit about, real world job advice. Keep in mind that hiring managers may get 100+ resumes on any job. How do you stand out? Please proofread and spell check. Keep in mind, if there's that many resumes, my job is to see how many I can eliminate. So don't give hiring managers a reason. Write a cover letter, even if it's not required. I want you to tell us why you want to work here, who you are. Oftentimes I've found that a good cover letter can make up for lack of experience. The other thing is be realistic about your expectations. There's a big difference between putting a sample on an instrument and actually fixing an instrument. And so if you see the picture here, this is actually a GC-MS opened up. And if you tell me that you're very experienced in fixing them, but you don't know where the ion gauge is, you're going to have a hard time convincing them that you're the right person for the job. So be realistic and be honest about that experience. Be prepared to start from the bottom. Labs are about experience, and do your homework. A lot of the interviews that we do, we give all of our candidates homework so that we can have a good discussion. If you don't do that and you don't come prepared, it makes our decision real easy on the back end. All right, and then lastly, I'd kind of like to just acknowledge a few people along the way. I will be the first one to admit I would not be in this position without having mentors and people who took an interest in me and helped me out along the way. So during my time working, in between undergrad and graduate school, I had a great boss named Steve who really took me under his wing and taught me a lot about kind of the bigger picture thinking. While I was at the University of Georgia, of course, my advisor, Ron Orlando, but I also had an industry advisor, which helped out a lot, just kind of getting a different perspective on things. So that was Dr. Barry Boyes at Advanced Materials Technology. And then my postdoc advisor at CDC, Melissa Carter. She taught me an awful lot about triple quad mass specs and, writing and things like that. So very appreciative to have those people. And then, of course, ACE Analytical Laboratory and Enthalpy Analytical Laboratory for giving me the opportunity and paying me to study marijuana. So. And then one last one I'm going to throw out. I do have a couple of positions that we're looking to hire out here in Berkeley, California with Enthalpy. So an entry-level position as a tech. And we've also got the chemist analyst position out there. So if that's something that you'd be interested in, we are always looking for good people. So I appreciate your attendance. I hope that you guys learned something here, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions that you guys have.